Dr. Comfort as sorry, Dr. Comfort Azubuko-Udah is an assistant professor of African literature at the University of Toronto, and she works at the intersection of African and post-colonial literatures, eco-criticism, and environmental humanities. Her scholarship and teaching focus on environmental justice, urbanity, and storytelling, particularly in conversation with global politics in African spaces and landscapes. Dr. Udah, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and hopefully not have any misadventures with that today. Okay. Okay. All right. So as I have said before, like this is very much a work in progress, and I do study literature, and there will be a lot of close reading in this talk. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that right now. So in most of its naturally occurring states, water has historically served as a rich source of narratives about everyday human life and development of our civilization. So water has served as a worthy spectacle and a robust object of exploration and meaning-making. It abounds in literature from all over the world and throughout recorded history. We have an abundance of narratives that represent the oceans as sublime and dangerous, representing rivers as the anchors of societies and sources of socioeconomic power, streams and marshes as the site of communal self-actualization, springs and geysers as objects of marvel and aesthetic appreciation, and even dams as a kind of engineering or technological sublime. If at all, the conversation is shifted to potable water, particularly piped potable water, much less is said. The relative absence of everyday domestic water sources, particularly in African literature, is just strange enough to merit this inquiry, because it begs the question, why is such a ubiquitous aspect of everyday life so largely absent from African realist fiction? And if we were to attend to it, what kind of work could it do for the narrativization of African urbanity? You know, aside from the spectacle of charity-driven, charisma-driven charity work. So a lot of the work that this chapter is pulled from focuses a lot on the idea of charisma and spectacle as it relates to storytelling or storying Africa and African spaces. So my work is really just invested in pivoting away from that. So in what follows, I argue that the significant absence of tap water, boreholes, and other piped and domesticated water sources in contemporary Nigerian realist fiction can be understood from an urban structural perspective. The invisibility of potable piped water in Nigerian literature is at least in part a reflection of the structural and politically induced silence around the inefficient and inadequate access to potable piped water as a social and public good. I will examine some of the history of socially induced silence about this subject, particularly where municipal water supplies and governmental responsibility are concerned. Storying piped water also might be one way to answer the narrativity challenge posed by Rob Nixon in Slow Violence. So Nixon urges that we engage a different kind of violence, a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive. Its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. In so doing, we also need to engage the representational, narrative, and strategic challenges posed by the relative invisibility of slow violence. Structural silence and structural violence go hand in hand, and slow violence also go hand in hand. Therefore, it is crucial to still find and tell these unspectacular, sort of slow or silent stories. The socially induced silence on piped water supply has fed, I argue, into a representational absence of this ubiquitous object in some of the most realist of Nigerian literature. However, I believe that there is room for the borehole and public tap to develop into literary to develop in literary representations into a Bakhtinian sort of chronotope, particularly in the communality and hope that it already symbolizes for everyday life. So Jumoke Verissimo's 2019 novel, A Small Silence, offers a rare model of what it could look like to represent piped water as part of everyday life in urban Africa without it being sort of affixed to a more charismatic figure like a celebrity activist or to a more spectacular topic like oil exploitation or environmental pollution. Verissimo's novel exemplifies some of the community and narrative building capacities of domesticated water in urban African settings. Narrativizing potable piped water. So there are, of course, many mundane parts of everyday life in urban Africa based on experience and based on the use of potable piped water as a motif in Verissimo's novel. Public standpipes and boreholes do have potential as a site for community building and the exploration of communal interactions. The issue is that there are plenty of infrastructural spaces for these same kinds of interactions to take place. So the marketplace, roadside stalls, informal commerce at road intersections, and the village river or the village stream. It therefore appears that boreholes and other kinds of piped water not possessing the longer history of community building as these other spaces I've mentioned, they're easily overlooked. In a study from the mid-20th century, as of 1963, the supply from this is a quote, the supply from boreholes amounted to 4 liters per capita per day, and the other 10 liters per capita that was needed by the people came from rivers and springs. The balance of water sources has certainly changed significantly since the 1960s. However, the public standpipe or borehole are still not the go-to space for a particular kind of urban representation that I think is available to us. They have not become, in a way, established as what we think of when we think of 20th and 21st century urban Africa. In comparison, for instance, in any urban home, the absence of electricity is far more conspicuous than the absence of water in the pipes where these pipes do exist at all. The darkness of a home without electricity or the noise and air pollution of a generator running to make up for its absence is far more difficult to ignore. It forces a confrontation in quite a few ways. It is a daily obnoxious reminder of the failures of the country's leadership. It's also particularly irksome for a country whose monoculture economy is dependent on oil to suffer such frequent energy shortages. Where electricity is concerned, guerrilla, informal, or communal means of intervention that might work more seamlessly for other problems do not work as well to sustain any household or neighborhood without resulting in a cascade of secondary problems. So in the absence of an efficient municipal water supply, for instance, one could sink a deep enough borehole to take care of the potable water needs of their household or even their community, should they be so generous. The negative consequences of this individual solution to the problem will not likely be perceived for decades. And this is recalling the slow violence of it all, right? However, a generator that's massive enough to supply electricity to the same household or the same community will quickly prove to be a nuisance in other ways. Even as it solves the problem of power supply, it will run up costs associated with fueling and maintenance. It will contribute significant air and noise pollution to the immediate environment, and it is not as easily accessible to residents of all socioeconomic classes. The conspicuousness of this particular municipal failure is evident in the fact that all over Nigeria, the acronym for the single agency that managed the use of electricity in Nigeria is commonly used as an exclamation. So even though the National Electric Power Authority, NEPA, has since been renamed and then eventually privatized and broken up into several smaller agencies, Nigerians everywhere will still exclaim NEPA whenever there's an electric outage. The same cannot be said for the largely defunct waterworks agencies in the country. A Small Silence, the novel, offers a model of narrativizing this largely uncharismatic object, piped water. So Jumoke Verissimo's 2019 novel offers the chance for reading piped water as an object with significations and meanings that are not associated with a more charismatic subject or person. The novel depicts water as a motive for hope, even if feeble, and it is often presented alongside the motive of light as a trigger of trauma. So A Small Silence follows the efforts of a professor and former activist as he struggles to reacquaint himself with life outside of incarceration. Professor Enio Lorinda Durotimi-Akani, simply called Prof throughout the novel, is introduced after he has spent a decade being tortured in prison at the direction of a former military ruler. So after he's released by a democratic elected president campaigning for a second term, Prof chooses to continue living in an environment that is so dark and devoid of light, even sound needs to be hushed. He curates a living space in which he can avoid having to confront anything outside of his fragile, diminished self. He's a hunted man with an imaginary friend and a fear of brightness and lights, whose trauma management relies heavily on piped water and a desperate need to maintain darkness in his immediate environment. He instead retreats into himself, scared to reintegrate into society, and simultaneously ashamed of his fears and his failure to confront reality. It is highly symbolic that Prof, who was famous for his voice and visibility in the public eye, is transformed into this traumatized character craving solitude and darkness. The other main character in this novel is her name is Desire Babangida. She's a university student whose devotion to Prof as an activist pushes her to persist in building a relationship with him and sort of coaxing him out of his solitude and darkness, with the hope that he will eventually open up his dark and silent home to light and to more human relationships. In the novel, we learn very quickly that light is an important motive where the Prof's trauma is concerned. His trauma is deeply tied to light because while incarcerated, his cell was kept dark until it was time to torture and mock him. He thought of those days in prison, and this is a quote, he thought of those days in prison when the light came on. He knew that only meant hot iron marks on his back, lashings, and sometimes punches that he felt his bones praying for a partial immobility, end quote. As a result of this experience, when he's released, he spends all day inside his flat with the curtains drawn and all the lights turned off. In this way, he manifests many symptoms of post-traumatic stress. He associates darkness with peaceful solitude. The relationship between silence and violence is particularly significant for a man who was a famous activist. He now retreats into darkness and silence as a salve for the violence he endured for years out of sight. It conveys a sense of safety within himself. Light, however, brings unpleasant confrontations, threats to life, and to his already fragile personhood. After he's released from prison, his mother repeatedly worries that he has become a shadow, and he confesses to Desire that, quote, "They took me away. I am not the one in this body anymore. They took me away." However, he tries to avoid confronting this loss of his body or substance. In darkness, he can be solid and whole, but light is what threatens to cast him as a shadow. It forces him to confront the reality that he has changed immeasurably in so many different aspects of his self-image. On the other hand, in contrast to light, water, particularly domesticated water, which has been structured or trained to go into the home or to serve everyday domestic needs, emerges throughout the novel as an object of safety. Prof seems to associate water, specifically piped water, with solace and grounding. In recollections of his time in prison and even in a hallucination he experiences, we can see the role water plays in his trauma. In one recollection, the narrative says, blood rushed down from his nose. He wanted to plead for mercy. Water, water, he said instead, and the two men who were torturing him laughed. After his torturers are gone, there was silence except for the sound of dripping water from the decking of his cell. While still experiencing this particular hallucinatory recollection of his trauma, he focuses on the water dripping off of his head as a way to ground himself. Prof pulled at his hair. He wanted his head off from his neck. He wanted to forget. So he concentrated on the pearls of water dribbling from the middle of his head to his face. I can't do it. And when he felt he was becoming loud, he cried, but it sounded like chuckles because he tried hard to suppress himself from a loud cry. Then from nowhere in his head, he heard, "Ha, put on the light." It was like his mother's voice, but it came with an authority he had never heard from her. He stopped his ears with his forefingers, but the voices were coming from inside him, and it became even louder and more confident. His breathing became labored. He wept. Desire, his mother, and even Kaya shouted, "Light, light, light." He heard some other voices shouting in his head too. He experiences a traumatic hallucination in which he struggles to find the balance between safety from the trauma triggered by light and the crushing self-imposed loneliness that comes with his insistence on darkness. The meditative efforts he undertakes are centered instead on water. However, a vision of his family and friends representing sort of a communal pressure to reintegrate himself, yelling for him to allow some light in, soon interrupts this effort. This psychologically trying episode manifests the dilemma he faces as he contemplates his future as a member of the community. Water comes to signify a kind of third option for him. It is an object on which he can focus his attention while delaying a confrontation with the trauma of light and the loneliness of darkness. So piped water and the structural silence is the next section. As of 2010, the United Nations affirms that access to clean water is a human right. What then does this mean that this right of access is not readily depicted in African realist fiction, in spite of the fact that the clean water charity machine focuses very heavily on African countries? Why are Nigerian novels more likely to approach potable water as a given or as an economic good? Where is the room for piped water to be depicted as part of the social infrastructure of day-to-day life? It could very well be narrativized as part of community building, as a site for advocacy, or for critiquing the national government. Charisma AC, she is an urban planning scholar who has studied the infrastructure of water supply in African cities extensively. She explains that while the right to water establishes a legal framework for individuals to claim their rights, the structure of water governance in many locales has been driven by an entirely different principle, one that treats water primarily as an economic good. It is therefore possible that where there is no explicit concern about pollution or some other violation of the water source, many African narratives are more likely to treat potable water as an economic good than a matter of human rights if it comes up at all, which it tends not to. I posit that this particular absence in realist fiction is a literary reflection of the structural silence around piped water access. Here is an overview of how attitudes towards piped water supply have been theorized. AC classifies silence, the structural silence, into these three categories. The first being unconscious loyalty, so being unaware of the problem, stopgap loyalty, hoping that things improve, and acquiescence, giving up out of fear or because of a perceived futility. So these the two first categories were previously established by some other scholar, but the third kind of loyalty is based on her own observations, specifically in Nigeria. Therefore, this third option really seems uniquely Nigerian or maybe even African, because she devises this new classification of silence based on her observation of attitudes towards water supply in urban Nigeria. She explains that acquiescence, or passive acceptance without consent, is in fact a kind of loyalty to the service provider that seems to best characterize the behavior of respondents she questioned in both Lagos and Benin City. This is because while the water problem is recognized and does warrant the use of voice or exit in the short or long term, there are other barriers that effectively silence voice or inhibit action. These barriers are effectively implemented by the governing bodies and the overall federal government through various strains of incompetence, unwillingness, and citizen intimidation. AC elaborates using the concept of political silencing, which is defined as, quote, the subordination of attitudes and behavior to authoritative viewpoints through hidden and quiet means versus noisy methods such as police power and prisons. This kind of silencing occurs through the, quote, discursive, coercive, but non-physically violent ways in which governments neutralize their critics and silence public criticism of state institutions. So giving up on the government, however, means that the people commit to doing community work around water and urban environmental care, and also in some ways commit to not talking about it at all. In this way, there is some overlap between the structural silence and Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence. He writes that by slow violence, he means a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. The prevalent choice of private boreholes all over the country is both an effect of the imposed structural and political silence, and also often a marker for slow violence when we consider both the risks of undetected contamination and the continued impoverishment of the poorest citizens who now have to spend all this money acquiring water from each day and negotiating their water supply from day to day. It is true that communal support institutions based on a variety of pre-existing organizational systems such as ethnicity, religion, traditional leadership, or trade and market structures, it's true that these communal support systems have intervened with mixed results to, quote, provide the various forms of infrastructure, human and physical, that are essential to the functioning of contemporary urban agglomerations. However, the structural silence is still undoubtedly pervasive, as it is not only shaped by the formal state, but is shaped through people's daily interactions with it, filtered in this case by different authoritative channels. As a result, people are conditioned to, quote, downplay the usefulness of complaining, as there is no one to complain to, no one to listen, because nothing will be done. In her study of Lagos and Benin City, AC found that both cities have experienced explosive growth in the number of households who installed private boreholes utilizing groundwater, much of which is actually contaminated. These households, in turn, sell water to their neighbors. There's, of course, no way to say for certain which boreholes are contaminated and which are not without conducting detailed studies and collecting a significant amount of data. The lack of data collection is also part of how structural violence is enforced and perpetuated, because silencing can be secured through poor or non-existent data collection, or the very social ties of kinship and associational life through which many communities survive. This in itself continues this thread of violence on the bodies of the community members, violence that we will not see immediately and may not see for decades to come. Since a lot of the realities of piped water access is not recorded officially, understanding the nature and role of potable piped water is left to anecdotal narratives and to oral history. And for the most part, the silence and slow violence continues and is perpetuated. In addition to the risk of undetected contamination, structural silence around potable piped water also obfuscates the sustained impoverishment of the already poor. So in a measurement of the efficacy and impact of municipal power and water supply, one study found that in Nigeria, outside of the, quote, 44% of households who have their own private boreholes, many members of the population rely on water vendors whose high prices amount to more than 30% of household income for the poorest. The contours of the structural violence are further illuminated when one considers that often the poor lack water because they are politically marginalized. The poorest of the poor must inhabit an infrastructure-free zone. However, there's also room for these realities not captured by official records and data to find representation and presence in realist fiction, I think. Since there is nothing new happening, nothing shifting or improving, the urban population of many African cities silently exits from municipal waterworks, except where larger or more charged political concerns are implicated. So for the purposes of AC's study, exiting the municipal sort of supply chain means sort of switching behavior that deprives an institution of the feedback mechanism that people may utilize when locked in. She then uses the example of households that invest significant capital into establishing their own boreholes, and so they're like very unlikely to rejoin the municipal water supply lines. In that sense, they've exited. These more charged scenarios, so it talks about people silently exit except where a larger or more charged political concern is implicated. So these more charged scenarios could be, for instance, water scarcity or water table pollution as a result of corporate interference. In that sense, there's like sort of a more charismatic, a more spectacular cause tied to the water supply. Even electricity, that's another mostly mundane part of day-to-day life that is crucial but often interrupted in Nigeria, is still intrinsically connected to a larger and more explosive conversation. or conversations. Since Nigeria has a monocultural economy, like I mentioned, that's reliant on crude oil, the electricity problem evokes issues such as, noise pollution, climate change, a stalled technological innovation and advancements in the country and the national economy. However, when it comes to water, a lot of people either exit the municipal network or informally address their needs without immediately causing a cascade of other problems. This is the acquiescence that we talked about before. In contrast, the proliferation of generators for private electricity supply in Nigeria brings about some immediately conspicuous social concerns. Noise and air pollution is right up there. People can dig a well or a borehole or pay to use a neighbor's borehole. They can contract the services of a meiroa without triggering a series of instantly discernible problems. So the situation does not appear as spectacularly dire. So a meiroa is a Hausa language phrase that loosely translates to person in charge of water. It is commonly used to refer to water carriers who fetch water from public standpipes or other sometimes mysterious piped water sources and then deliver to the households who have contracted their services. In light of the pervasive structure that enables silence, it appears that this structural silence carries through to Nigerian fiction, as I've said before. To this point, we could take a very brief look at, for instance, Chigozie Obiama's 2019 novel, An Orchestra of Minorities. There is a remarkable absence of a clear domestic water source in this very domesticity-focused tale of a poultry-owning protagonist. We get detailed descriptions of his daily chores as he gets up, he cleans his house, feeds his chickens, packs up for the market, and so on. However, the only real mention of where he gets his domestic and potable water is indirect. The narrator only gestures to it. So here's a quote from the book. He walked into the kitchen, fetched water from a blue keg, and his thoughts were suspended by the recollection that they were running out of drinking water. The keg was the only one of the three he had with drinking water still left in it. The family who owned two big tanks and sold water in the street had been gone for 2 weeks, and many of the people in the street either drove to get water from elsewhere or drank rainwater, which they collected in bowls or basins or drums while it rained. In this passage, we get a mention of big storage tanks from which the family sells water to the street. However, we're not told whether they get this water from a private borehole, which is most likely, or not, or if not, why the rest of the street does not have the same access to collect and store potable water on their own. There is no indication of what sort of place or water source this, quote, elsewhere could be. Given the level of detail the narrator provides about the protagonist's daily chores, and also the fact that domestic water is such an essential part of those tasks, it's certainly remarkable to have no meditation in this water supply chain. The only other commentary about potable water in the novel is the protagonist's guardian spirit, who's the narrator, marveling at the fact that water is treated as an economic good. So he says of the protagonist, he waved down a peddler who went about carrying water in small sealed bags, hawking his wares, buy pure water, buy pure water. Agujebe, this buying and selling of water has always amazed me. The old fathers would never have imagined, even in the time of drought, that water, the most abundant provision of the great earth goddess herself, could be sold the same way hunters sell porcupines. Here, the otherworldly narrator calls into question the view of potable water as an economic good, believing it ought to remain a public and common good. However, in modern times, water, particularly potable and piped water, has become simultaneously a resource, an uncooperative commodity, a public good, a private good, an economic good, a productive input, and a potent symbol. And this is from AC's Silence and Voice. As a result, each day, members of the urban population have to navigate the hybrid terrain of water supply. Obiama's protagonist, for instance, drinks the stale remnants of the water he bought from his neighbor's tanks. But like the rest of the people on his street who might resort to rain, he also has to make these daily negotiations on where to source water depending on the need. In the passage I just read to you, he's choosing to purchase an expensive kind of drinking water, so the sachet water, particularly when compared to what he must have paid per liter for the water he drinks from the blue keg. That's more expensive. These passages offer just a passing critique of water as an economic good in this setting. However, there's room still for a deeper meditation on the other meanings and narrative potentials for potable piped water in similar urban settings across the country. To return to A Small Silence, it's important to position a little bit sort of the living conditions of the novel's two main characters, particularly keeping in mind the context of municipal water supply failings and the concept of structural silence. Prof is only able to stay holed up indoors and in darkness in his flat because aside from getting food deliveries from his mother, he has access to all the water he needs to sustain himself. Desire, however, lives in a different part of the same estate where their access to water has been permanently cut off. So here's a passage sort of explaining a little bit of that. All of the estate used to have water when the blocks of flats were first built, but before they moved in, she and her friend, 2 years after they moved into the area, 2 years before they moved in, some water pipes were broken, and even though the road was rebuilt, no one considered repairing the pipes. Some houses then, as a result, built boreholes because it was seemingly easier to build a borehole than to get anyone out there to repair the broken pipes. Many of the neighbors eventually removed their bathtubs and placed them in front of their flats, where they served as water storage and washing bowls. Those who lived on the ground floor found it easier to get the Meroa, who fetched water for people for a fee, to supply them. And this is just such a perfect example of the acquiescence AC talks about. The people who live in the affected parts of the estate have, for all intents and purposes, accepted that those broken water pipes will likely never be repaired. And even though the estate might be under private management, there's no hope. Here we find a literary depiction of structural silence that may go beyond state actors. The existence of the estate itself as a unit of urban or suburban aggregation is quite common in major Nigerian cities. There are, of course, estates representing different socioeconomic tiers. These often gated neighborhood communities illustrate how sort of more and more the sphere of social reproduction, healthcare, education, nutrition, etc., is being offloaded to individuals who have to fend for themselves while at the same time subsidizing capitalism by alleviating both corporations and states from having to supply basic necessities or commodifying what was previously provided by the state or corporate entities. The estate itself can be understood as an urban communal housing arrangement that facilitates the distribution of shared resources and fosters a sense of safety and community. In the estate structure, we can see how, in spite of leadership failures, the people have, quote, have struggled not just to survive, but also to mend and craft new social and spatial strategies through practices of everyday life. These processes also sometimes create new centers of possibility. This social arrangement does in fact create a new center of possibility, as reflected in the story of Prof and his budding relationship with Desire Babangida. From her decision in one of the scenes to walk over and knock on his door, to the frequent late night visits that would characterize the budding friendship, late night discussions in his living room, and then their eventual encounter in daylight at the end of the novel. The existence of this estate community is deeply vital to the development of their relationship as the two main characters in the novel. She may not have ever known where he lived after his release from prison, if not for the estate grapevine that brings her the news. She would not have felt as comfortable staying out until midnight each time, if not for the sense of safety that the insularity of an estate permits. Even the status of the estate's varied access to potable water proves crucial to their story. Not knowing that he was finally out of his flat in the daylight, Desire deliberates on whether she could once again visit Prof because, quote, for a moment, Desire considered carrying a bucket of water to Prof's doorstep as an excuse to see him in the day, before she remembered that his flat was in one of the buildings that did not have water issues like hers, end quote. In this moment, the shared knowledge of their estate community proves vital, but beyond that, the motive of piped water once again crops up to serve as an opportunity for encounter. In other words, piped water shows up as a site for conversation, socialization, and community building. In conjunction with the informality of the estate community, the relationship between Desire and Prof represents a viable angle for narrativizing piped water as a chronotype of African urban literature. In the final scene of the novel, we see the clearest manifestation of water as a motive of hope and solace. It is important to observe that water is able to serve this purpose in the Prof's post-incarceration life because of his degree of access. It becomes such an easy object to reach for and is often very close when he needs a social crutch. In several instances throughout the text, Prof offers his guests a cup of water when they ask an uncomfortable question and he needs an escape. In the final scene of the text, water once again serves this purpose for him. So up until this point, his friendship with Desire had been built entirely in the darkness of his living room. Consequently, neither of them knows exactly what the other person looks like. Desire only has an idea based on old pictures of Prof as a young activist. However, after a disagreement between them, she stops visiting, and the loneliness Prof experiences in her absence eventually drives him out into the neighborhood to search for her in the daylight. He wanders around the large estate, asking questions and hoping to run into her, to tell her that, quote, the room is lit. However, when they eventually come face to face, neither of them is entirely sure what to make of the other. The narrator tells this encounter, focalizing Desire first, and then retells it from Prof's perspective. So we follow Desire through her day as she realizes that she needs water in her flat and does not have enough money to afford the Meiroa. She makes a few trips to the public standpipes to refresh her water supply back home. And this is a very long quote from the book, so I don't think I'm going to read all of it, but I'm just going to go into my sort of reading of it, I guess. So Desire in this passage fails to recognize Prof because he is neither well-groomed nor well-dressed, and so does not match the mental image that she had of him. He's thwarted once again by light, which causes her to actually see him and thus misrecognize him. He is therefore unable to take full advantage of the opportunity afforded by the social space of the standpipes. Instead, he leans back into his social crutch, choosing to bend down to the taps to wash his face as she watches. In this scene, even for her, the space of the taps allows her to navigate a confrontation with a strange man she's unable to properly recognize. She, quote, held the tap lightly, either for stability in the face of an uncomfortable social situation or as a potential weapon to defend herself, because she says she stood there holding the tap lightly, like she could pull it out and hit him with it if he tried something malicious. Due to the social space of piped water, the public taps also allow for an added layer of support. Although the rest of the street was momentarily preoccupied, the communal space means that she's not really alone with what she perceives to be a vagabond and a potential threat. From Prof's viewpoint, this encounter seems to signify a rejection of his efforts at reintegration. We see that as Desire walks away, he concludes that their encounter in the daylight would preclude any further development of their relationship, because in the end, he looked on in the direction of the departing girl, thinking only imagination can destroy its own creation. Although he has rightly noted her disappointment in his appearance, the fact still remains that she's still enthralled with him and his intellect. She has not written the Prof off as a vagabond because she has not positively identified the man at the taps. In fact, the encounter at the taps is what pushes her to conclude that she would, quote, visit the Prof that night. The novel ends on this cliffhanger where we are left to imagine what their visit that night would look like. The encounter at the public taps continues to signify hope in the everyday lives of these two characters. Although the light of the day appears to thwart Prof's efforts at reintegration once again, this time by calling into question Desire's mental image of him, it's really crucial to the narrativization of piped water in this novel that he's finally able to emerge from darkness in the first place. Ultimately, he's able to approach Desire fully lit. The public water taps provide a social crutch for him and a site of communal socialization for their relationship in the context of the housing estate. In this social space of piped water, he finds a counter to the symptoms of his post-traumatic stress. Water emerges as the vehicle for his reintegration into the community. So to conclude, I would like to read to you one of Desire's musings from the novel. She says, I've always considered how some stories will never get told. It's the way it is, Ireti. She's talking to a character named Ireti. Silence is where we go to listen to those stories. Sit in silence and listen. Silence tells stories too, you know. There might not be a single answer for why such a ubiquitous part of everyday life in urban Nigeria is largely absent from Nigerian literature. The history of narrativizing piped water suggests that it presents a challenge, that for it to be narrativized at all, it needs to borrow some charisma from some other figure or object or subject that looms larger and garners more affect and more visibility. Potable piped water by its very nature, if it's piped, is often invisible and hard to notice in a world where many other objects and infrastructural characteristics of urban Africa loom larger. This is why Verissimo's A Small Silence is significant in my analyses. It presents a model of how drinking water and the infrastructure that delivers it can be made to signify something locally relevant in itself. The next step in this project would be to explore, perhaps in a chronological manner, the social spaces of domestic water through the decades. In the rapid urbanization of African spaces over the past decades, was there an untold story in the developmental shifts in water supply and sourcing? This could cast more light on how we've arrived, at least in urban African spaces, to this place where there's often an unmet and silenced need for municipal water infrastructure. What does this structural and literary silence tell us? And that's the end. And I think I went on a little long, but that's it.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Udah. It was a really wonderful presentation. I now give over to Prof. Makoni.
Thank you very much, Comfort. I know there are novels in Nigeria about university life, for example. Now, my question is, in those novels, do they also talk about water? Let's say university campus life, do they talk about water as well? And if so, how is water handled within a campus that is different from the way water might be handled, let's say, in Lagos or in Benin?
I'm not sure if there are some particular novels you have in mind, but so this in this novel that I do read,
yes.
there at least 3 of the characters are students at State University, and so they commute from Desire commutes from where she lives. She doesn't live on campus. I don't know if there will be much of a distinction, because I feel like even on campus they still have to make sort of these daily negotiations. So I'm not sure, but that might be something to think about, especially because the university, I guess, it represents sort of a smaller governmental scale than a big, But I feel like maybe that's something that could also be replicated in like an estate community. Talk about a little bit, but something to think about.
Because when I was in West Africa, the universities came across like self-contained entities, right? And most of the students lived within the university. But there was always a sense in which you were balancing having to get water, go to classes, go to the library, and all those were demands that you needed to constantly balance. Something that I wasn't aware of before I went to West Africa. But anyway, now my next question, the other question that I want to ask, this is a very sort of general question. I know you concentrate on Nigeria Fair. Are there any other scholars who are looking at issues about water in other areas of literature, let's say the Caribbean, Kenyan literature, etc.? And what are they coming up with? In other words, are they water scholars in literature, but in different regions of the world?
Yeah. So I think what I've realized
Uh-huh.
trying to do this work is that yes, there are scholars of water, but they tend to focus on like oceans and lakes,
Oh, yes. Okay.
rivers, streams, those kinds of things.
Yes. Yes.
And then the people who talk about this kind of water that I'm focusing on
Yes.
not to be in the humanities at all. So they tend to be urban what's it called? Urban studies scholars.
Yes. Yes.
They're in urban planning or some other field like that. So I think trying to find myself in this in-between space has been a little difficult because there's just such a dearth of there's not enough things that I'm able to find to talk about, like to engage with. So finding myself like close reading urban planning documents or close reading an urban studies article to sort of relate to it. And it really just, I think, reflects some of the silence thing I was talking about. So yes, there are a lot of scholars who study water, and I think I even mentioned in my abstract, like Elizabeth Delogre has a whole book out.
Oh, yes.
Like, the turn to water and to oceans and environmental humanities. And there's there are water pedagogies, like sort of conversations happening and whole fields relating to that, but they tend to engage, like I said before, like rivers and streams and more often like oceans, there's islands, even swamps and marshes. Like you talk about the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh, or the Niger Delta, like those are more spectacular sort of kinds of water to engage, and they have a much longer history than municipal water supply in urban Africa that's only like half a century old or something.
Yes, yes. So why then did you get interested in water in the Nigerian novels? What led you that path?
Yeah, so the projects that I'm working on, so my book project right now, and I guess part of my dissertation project was basically around this idea of attending to African landscapes and urban spaces in a way that does not prioritize and does not re-emphasize the spectacular, the charismatic the same way, to sort of allow for a fuller image to emerge, an image that doesn't necessarily have to grab attention and be globally relevant and always have this sort of running thread of like the global, which of course always be relevant, but I think there's a need to look at stories that are maybe not as spectacular, objects that are maybe not as charismatic, but allow us to attend to African spaces as locally relevant within themselves. So I think one of the things I talk about, for instance, is because I focus on Nigeria. The reason I focus on Nigeria too is because Africa is so big. Africa is too big to make like 54 friggin' countries. Yeah. Too big to like try and do the whole thing. Even Nigeria is really big. So I felt like I had to start narrowing from there.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why it's focused on Nigeria, because I'm also sort of anxious about coming up with too many generalizations. I feel like that kind of top down, like handing down of sort of categories and criteria is not the way that
you want to proceed.
That I want to proceed in scholarship. There's a very sort of white European man from 2 centuries ago kind of energy about that I'm trying to avoid. So I think it's important to sort of embrace the specificity of certain spaces, but not necessarily like discounting the things that are globally relevant, because they still are. But I think there's value in in engaging with stories, not based on what's most engaging for an international audience, but it's based on like what tells a fuller story of the spaces that we do inhabit all over the country.
Let me ask you the last question, then I'll hand over to Chanel, and other people will come in, and then I can come in later on. I missed the connection you were trying to draw between electricity and water. What was the connection you were trying to make?
I think I'm not sure if it's a connection so much as it is like a comparison.
Oh, okay.
So you know, I feel like I think electricity is so if you think about like the aspects of daily life in urban Nigeria, I feel like electricity is the sort of the object of municipal supply that is talked about a lot, that is connected to some sort of some other like larger spectacular subjects. So it, you know, like I said, it evokes conversations about the nation's economy being a economy, about crude oil and the sort of really overwhelming implications of the sourcing of crude oil, the way that, you know, the environmental degradation that comes from it, the mismanagement of it, the corruption, like it opens all of these sort of like monumental, really large conversations about the country in a way that the water supply does not, but the electric supply does. So I think it was really just a comparison to say, these are two sort of utilities that are, you know, part of everyday life, but this one is kind of disappearing under the radar, and then this one is sort of looming large in these particular ways. So yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you. Let me hand over to Chanel.
Thanks, Prof. Okay, so we already have 3 questions. Gabriel, it's the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot her name.
Comfort.
Comfort, because I was trying to seek here. Okay, thank you, Comfort, for your talk. Interestingly, because most of us, I think, are linguists or applied linguists, and we rarely see this discussion in applied linguistics, and this is very interesting that you can have discussion on literature. And I'm a novelist too, from Brazil. I have my latest book here. It's a novel, and I would like to talk to you about, because this discussion made me to leave a statement on our most important Black writer in Brazil nowadays, who's Conceição Evaristo, who wrote many novels and books, and she's now a member of a committee arranging to publish another writer who was Black from the favela in Rio, and she was criticized by a scholar from our universities that she said that the group would publish her with non-appropriate Portuguese. And this would ensure the novel wouldn't be read. So I had to leave a statement on that, on how we should talk about characters, and of course about content that we bring us when you talk about water literature and water scholars in Nigeria. And I know we in Nigeria, we have more in common about our ancestors and novels and literature, but I would like to hear you about you using water as a commodity. I think, I don't know if you agree with me, first of all, if you're using water as a commodity. So, and if so, we speak from a country which is sometimes regarded as the country of water in the world, which is Brazil. Not true, because our water is I'll write down, Kim, just a moment. It's the river of black bloody, or bloody black. It's the river of blood of black kids. It's the river of blood of black kids. This is the title. Thank you. So you using water as a commodity, first of all, and if so, we are from a monocultural country. We have many things that you used to were used to imprison Africans, most of them coming from Nigeria, in the slavery. How can you connect, or how do you see connection in the future as you see water? How you can see the future of African countries that have problems concerning water as a commodity? And the first question, to repeat, if you see water as a commodity to the world now and to Nigeria specifically. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I'm gonna try and sort of so I guess the main question is, do I see water as a commodity, or am I using water as a commodity? I don't think it's necessarily about like how I'm using it. I think I talk about I mentioned like in 2010 the United Nations said water is a human right, like access to clean water is a human right? And that's the way that it should be, right? Like access to clean water should be a human right. And there's there have been sort of and I'm going to forget the particular instances from all over the world, but there have been like moments where a body of water has been sort of treated as its own entity for its preservation, for sort of like environmental purposes. So there are things that there's a way that it ought to be, and then there's a way that it actually is. And I think the economic good part of it, or the commodity angle, is an unfortunate reality, but it is just the reality. It's not necessarily a perception that I'm bringing to the idea of like clean water. It's just the reality. Like people do have to make these daily negotiations. Am I going to drink rainwater today, or am I going to buy sachet water? Am I going to pay my neighbor to use their borehole? All of these things involve sort of like spending money and making all these negotiations. Like if you have more money, you have hopefully better access to clean water and stuff like that. So it's not really the way that I'm using it. It's just I'm looking at what the reality is and how this reality is depicted in fiction, right? Especially with this paper specifically, and then talking about the implications of that narrativization. So it's not a thing that I'm bringing to the study of water. And so you mentioned sort of like the history of Black people and water and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that conversation does revolve around the ocean, with the triangular trade and all of that in the Middle Passage. But I think moving ahead with this project, I think one of the things that I do want to look at is not necessarily the ocean, but it's the sources of clean water that existed in or continue to exist actually in African spaces before and alongside sort of boreholes and municipal water supply. So I want to look at sort of the social space of potable water before it was piped. So the social space of getting water from the stream or from a spring or something. Sometimes I still go home to my village and we go fetch water from the stream, and it's a whole thing because you see like random third cousins there and stuff like that. And I feel like there's a long history there that I might want to delve into a little bit to sort of try to understand how that sort of how that social space has transformed over time, and what it is about moving from a stream to a borehole that might have made it less worthy of narrativization in a fictional sense. But I think that's that would be my my engagement with that and yeah, for this project at least.
Yeah, thanks so much. I now move over to Phoebe.
Thank you so much. I'm making two connections to this. One is a personal one. So my younger sister who went to, I'm from Ghana, went to school in Iberi Girls. We had to carry water every week, drive about an hour to school. So talking about water as an economic good, yes. And thinking of, okay, so what did people whose parents could not do that trip, what were they doing? Or to afford to give them water to pay the tankers that would come and fill their barrels. And going to school, at that school, your identity was around water. It was about how am I getting through the week? Where am I getting water from? Before, what am I studying? So, and then the irony of now as an adult, I went home about a few months ago, you have flooding due to bad drainage, and it's all over in the news. It's what everybody's talking about. And it gets worse every year because people are building, I mean, land, the whole idea of landscape. So thank you for expressing a silent narrative. That was my second point, the fact that the phenomenon of silent narratives. I don't think I would have I had thought of it in that manner, as in like, yeah, so much of at least life in Ghana revolves around water and when you're getting it, when the water is flowing, when it's not, where are you going to get it from? Do you know the person? You know, it's just such a big part of our lives, but we don't have a narrative for it. And so, yeah, thank you for giving voice to something that is normally a silent issue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that more. But did you have a question or did I just miss it?
No, I was just making a connection.
Okay.
No, I didn't have a question. No.
All right, great. Thank you. Yeah, but we should talk more, Phoebe.
Magda?
Thank you so much, Comfort, for your presentation, for reading aloud pieces of the novels. The power of the narrative and probably also your voice took me to a different place and to the context that I'm familiar with in Ecuador, where stories about and legends about water are very much intertwined with the religion. So you will find many saints in Ecuador, either Virgin Mary or Jesus, connected with some kind of miracle related to water. So you will have El Señor de las Aguas in the south of Ecuador, or in the part of Tungurahua, there is Nuestra Virgen de Agua Santa. So what those saints have somehow in common is that they represent a gift, not that much from the nature, because that's not the point of the Catholic religion, but the gift from God, right? That they worship, that they actually those saints, they start forming part of who those communities are. So when sometimes those saints, those figures, they travel through different villages, and then people say, "Oh, our saint of the water came back to the village," and there is a celebration. So my question is, if you have found in your research on the novels you've been looking at, the narratives, maybe some of them oral, right? Because legends, in the majority of cases, they are oral. If you found this intersection between water and either religion or maybe more broadly spirituality.
Oh, I definitely think there's rich connections between water broadly and religion and spirituality. I mean, the strongest image is coming to my mind is like just the story of Mami Wata from all over different parts of Nigeria, different parts of Africa. And I think that sort of mermaid figure exists in some way all over the world. Thinking about that, thinking about like certain versions of Christian or Christian adjacent religions that rely on water, like either in the form of a stream or an ocean. Like in Lagos, if you go to any beach, like really early in the morning, you'll see people like dressed in white out there, like doing their prayers and all these things. You know, people in many parts of Nigeria, like Christians will be baptized, not in a fancy pool in the church, but in an actual stream somewhere. So I think those connections do exist, but they do tend to exist in connection with like bodies of water. So like in connection, not naturally occurring bodies of water, not like a flood, right? Which, you know, a third of Nigeria right now is underwater, unfortunately, because of what Phoebe was talking about. It's similar in Nigeria as well. But the connection between just water broadly and religion and spirituality is there. It's been, you know, it's there, it's been studied, and probably deserves some more studying, especially as things have been progressing and changing, as the landscape has been changing, right? You know, all the land reclamation in Lagos and pushing back the ocean, I feel like that all of that has significant consequences for these things. But yeah, but I do think it still sort of implicates like the bigger sort of longer histories of these like bodies of water that I'm not necessarily engaging with in this particular project. But yes, they're there. They're there, and they're very prevalent, prominent. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Mohammed. Thank you, Comfort, for a very interesting presentation. I'm interested in mythologies of water. What myths do you encounter in your research? In Morocco, it is believed that pouring hot water in a sink at night would trigger the rage of jinns and therefore must be avoided. Water also is used to clean the body in preparation for prayer or to prepare the dead body before burial. Sacred water at Makkah is believed to carry curing, healing powers. Are there similar beliefs in Nigeria related to water inside the homes? Thanks for your research.
That's such an interesting thing. And now I'm thinking about it, and that might be something to look into to try and figure that out. I can't think of anything immediately. Like this is not really water inside of the home, but it's, you know, I'm thinking about like consecrated water, you know, like in Catholic churches or maybe some other churches where they use like holy water, you know, and sprinkle it and all these things. Yeah, but I hadn't thought about, that's very interesting that there are myths about water inside the home and sort of this superstitious storying of water inside the home, but I hadn't thought about that, and that'll be an interesting thing to consider. Thank you, Mohammed, for that.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. Okay, I now give over to Desmond.
Thank you, Chanel, and thank you, Comfort. I was actually just trying to type something in the chat box in response to Mohammed's question, because something else came to mind, and I'll get to the commenting question I wanted to ask earlier. I was talking to some friends a while ago who made a note that there is some part of the Igbo land where people would not take a bath with water that was exposed overnight, like in an open bucket, because they believe anything could have happened to it. Some spirit could have inhabited that water overnight, and then taking a bath with it could put you in some danger. I don't know how widespread a culture it is in that area, but I think the person was making reference to this in the Anambra area of Igbo land. Anyway, Comfort, you know, I relate to what you were talking about because I was born and grew up in Nigeria. So you sort of brought this home in a unique way. So thank you for doing that. Two pieces here. The silencing is critical, especially in the connection or comparison we're making with electricity, with light and with NEPA. Because one could argue that people could survive without electricity in a way that they could not with water. Yet, there is less attention to and commentary on water. And it's not just, like you were noting, it's just in the literature, but really just public consciousness or activism. People seem to sort of find their way around sorting out their water needs in a way that they don't often do with electricity. There's at least public consternation about electricity. And part of my interest about that silencing or question here is there anything one can say about the technologies of power or the technologies of coloniality that sort of drags the most basic of needs into that sphere of negotiation where people give up? I think I might have been hearing this in part of your presentation, but I wasn't quite clear about that. That is, what happens in the power dynamics of coloniality that puts something as basic as water in such a sphere where people no longer think about it as a public need on which to negotiate with the nation state. There is another side to this, though. If we think of the establishment of the Nigerian nation state, like I think you're suggesting here, as a fairly recent phenomenon, how had people been wrestling with water needs in the past, before independence, perhaps even before the arrival of Europeans in this more recent episode of imperialism? And is it possible that Nigerians never fully ceded that personal, private, or community access to water to coloniality in a way that they might have other things? For instance, could one argue that people have always had ways of accessing water or thinking about water in their communities prior to the establishment of the nation state? But with electricity, the provision of electricity came with the establishment of the nation state. And can one then use that understanding as a window into thinking of a post-state reality, a post-Nigerian state reality, where people are capable of reclaiming aspects of their lives that have been sort of taken over or colonized by a colonial institution like the Nigerian nation state? There are a few other pieces of this that I might come to later, but I'll just stop for here. But thank you again for this. This is amazing.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just making note. Those are just such excellent points. I think the last point that you just made about sort of accessing water in this daily negotiations and where to get water being like something that preceded the nation state, and perhaps there's like a it's not something that people have come to expect, and so it's easier to sort of relinquish or absolve, not absolve, but to like not put the responsibility on the nation state. But you mentioned like people no longer negotiating with the nation state around water specifically, and I think as thinking of Nigeria, which is where my research is based, like this particular project is based, I think there's just not, I mean, I don't want to go on a rant about the Nigerian government, but I think
it's okay sometimes to do that, or trust, I should say, it's unavoidable sometimes.
it really is, but I think we just have a history now, or like we've kind of gotten to this reality where it's just like it's not gonna work, so I'm gonna try and figure it out myself type of thing. And I think we one of my theories around that is like we just never really, I think, going from being colonized to then having this kind of political system we have where being a politician means like enriching yourself and your immediate people. It's a continuation of the sort of like handed down colonial authority, and it's, you know, it's not independent governance in the true sense that we would ideally want. And I think there's just that sort of filters through in the culture of how we perceive our political system. It filters through in how people think about things like voting or holding their government accountable, because with colonization, there was no way to hold the government accountable. They were like, you know, they were just in charge and they were going to do what they were going to do. And I think that sort of attitude passed on, like, you know, the leaders look like us now, but they're the same sentiments and the same attitudes are still there. And so within the masses, I think is the same kind of thing where it's like, well, they're not going to do what we want them to do. There's a difficulty in sort of like holding the leaders accountable. There's almost no sort of there's no sort of strong enough structure or infrastructure to do that, to go and talk to your local government councillor and be like, hey, we need a public pipe. Like there's no like town halls that you can go and voice your opinion in this sort of strong way that actually will bring a change. And I think that might be shifting. I'm trying not to be foolishly hopeful about the next few years, especially with the catalyst of the sort of NSARS movement and all of this sort of activism that's happening and people rallying around a certain candidate that that I don't want to start talking about, but that culture might be shifting. But that is, I think, what the present culture is in Nigeria, especially when it comes to our relationship with the official government. I feel like in another project that I did, I made a distinction between Nigeria, the official nation state, and Naija, which is like the people, right? And there's a lot of sort of innovation, ingenuity, and like, you know, there's a lot of forward movement and growth in the Naija sphere of things. But when you include sort of the government and try to look at the interaction between the two, it's just all sad, kind of. And so I think, yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily specifically about water that precludes sort of the negotiation with the nation state. I think there's just a very much broader culture of like just giving up on the nation state, and you know, Charisma AC calls it acquiescence, and it's something that she observed specifically studying water supply in Nigeria, where people are just like, they're not going to do anything, and they really don't do anything, and so people feel like they need to take care of themselves, they need to take care of things, you know. Government schools going on strike, you know, then there's a proliferation of private universities. There's no water supply, then there's a proliferation of boreholes. There's no electricity, every house has a generator. Even people who live in a face me, I face you, like 1-bedroom apartment have a little baby generator. Like, you know, there are just so many different ways that all over Nigeria, people just feel this need to just take care of their own thing as best as they can, because the government's not going to. There are no jobs, so everybody has a business, everybody has a side hustle, and like 5 side hustles and things like that. So it's broader, but I think it might be interesting to look at the last thing you mentioned, which is that water supply is something that people have had to figure out for ages before colonization and before the establishment of the nation state. And I think that's where maybe some of the conversations about like sort of smaller communities and the way that people within a community help each other might be relevant. And yeah. But thank you for that. It really got me thinking. I'm trying not to get too heated, so I'm going to stop here.
Well, if you don't mind that I just make another 2 quick footnotes on that. And I really am fascinated with this work, so I'm going to be following you for the next several years. So one is, as we're talking about this, it struck me that, you know, part of the phenomenon I've observed is that not only do the citizens no longer hold public officials accountable for the provision of water specifically, but sometimes government officials at the state level, I observe this mostly, would actually initiate and commission the construction of a borehole, what you were talking about, so tapping water from the aquifer, no longer building a municipal water network, but just tapping that for a particular community, and they are celebrated for doing that. So doing something similar to what private citizens will do in an estate or in their private homes. So it almost seems like even the government itself has given up on the idea of municipal water supply. And I recall vividly before I left Nigeria for the US, that we lived in one of the few houses on the block that had that municipal power supply, whose pipes had not been shut yet. I don't even know if it still runs. Of course, the water, the service comes maybe twice in a week, like 2 days in a week, or sometimes even once in a week. But it seems like the government itself has sort of given up completely on that. The second, maybe two-pronged footnote here is that so where I live in the Chicagoland area, we pay for utilities in such a way that the amount of water you pay for is also the amount of waste removal you pay for. And I think the waste disposal in Nigeria, I'm talking about biological waste disposal in households, requires water in the ways that public structures are constructed today. So when people are thinking and talking about water to drink and to cook and so forth, you're also talking about, you're talking essentially about how does the water make it into the home and how does it leave the home? And I wonder if there's something to explore there. But to that last point about communities taking over control, my sense is I see this also with security. Communities establishing vigilante security in response to failures of policing in their communities, or perhaps even more accurately, the violence that is inflicted on their communities by the government police. So again, I'm wondering if there is something hopeful here that eventually communities will take over enough control that we no longer are talking about or to Nigeria, but to Niger, to use your reference. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. The thing you mentioned about a government, state official sort of like sinking a borehole instead of thinking about municipal water supply. Honestly, I'm not gracious enough to think that that's them giving up on the possibility of municipal supply. I really just think it's one of those things where someone will do the bare minimum for the photo opportunity, right? Like they will, I mean, one politician in Lagos was he went viral for the wrong, for all the wrong reasons, because instead of doing something more meaningful and more sort of like broadly serving, like he took pictures of himself providing like buckets of water for people to wash their hands and hand sanitizers. And it's like, people are actually dying, and this is all you can think to do. And it's not, I think it's not the same, it's not the same like sentiment of acquiescence that's coming from the masses. It's a sort of, it's more sinister than that. It's more malicious than that, because I really do believe that they do have the resources if they wanted to do more, but they would rather like pocket the money and do whatever the bare minimum is to get a picture, or sometimes they don't even bother doing the bare minimum. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm completely disillusioned by Nigerian politics. So, but yes, thank you for these points and these notes that you've made, Desmond. This is great.
Thank you. Jane, the floor is yours.
Hi, my camera is not on.
That's fine.
Oh, okay. I think I got it though. Hello, I enjoyed your presentation. I'm also Nigerian, and I was just wondering, I'm sure you've heard of the phrase, it's a pidgin phrase that says, water no get enemy. And basically water is such a strong force. And what I find interesting with the discussions is how the Nigerian people, they found ways to, in the absence of holding the government accountable, or even trying to hold the government accountable and that not being productive, they found ways to do things for themselves, like with electricity, with security, with water. And just knowing that water is such a strong force, and with everything going on in Nigeria right now with the floods, a big part of that is the actual land itself. So the infrastructure of roads and how water causes erosion of roads and roads in Nigeria, that infrastructure is just lacking on a very primary level. So now add in the factor of flooding, which is related to your related to water, which is, you know, your what your presentation is about. So I'm just wondering, like, if you think I think there's a relationship there, but I'm wondering what you think of it. And with all these other infrastructures, like the electricity and security, like people having to like navigate around the problems surrounding those infrastructures, I feel like road is something that you can't like fix. You can't run from it. You can always get a generator. You can always move to a better neighborhood for security reasons. You can always get a borehole. You can have 3 boreholes. You can, you know, money can help you with that. But I feel the road, like everyone is gonna, whether rich or poor, whatever neighborhood you're in, you're gonna get affected by it. So I'm just wondering what you think of that, and just in general how it factors in.
This is so interesting because both you and Desmond have brought up subjects that are going to be like I've brought up objects, sorry, that are going to be the subject of other chapters in my book project, potentially. One of them was waste and the other is roads, and like sort of the idea of like asphalt and you know, toll roads and all of that stuff. And I was going to say this to Desmond as well, like I had thought about waste, but I hadn't thought about the connection between waste and water. And it's the same here, like where I thought about roads, but not the connection between roads and water. And I think these are sort of important questions that you're raising. I think there's definitely a lot to be said there. And I think that's going to be like a different chapter, a different project, and it's something to think about. But yes, you're right. Like it's harder to have sort of a guerrilla intervention on bad roads. Like the most any rich man can do is to pave the like half a kilometer right leading up to his house. And you know, we've seen that a few times where it's like there's a little close or a little cul-de-sac, and then they have enough money to call in people to come like grade that road and put asphalt on it. But then that doesn't that still creates more problems, because then it doesn't have proper drainage, and when it rains, it's a whole thing. It's one of the sort of like equalizing, as you were pointing out, equalizing sort of aspects of the infrastructure in Nigeria, because you can buy a Ferrari and your Bentley, but it's going to enter the same pothole as my beat up like Toyota Camry, right? Like because the road is the road, like, and everybody has to drive on it to get from one place to the other. As I'm saying that now, I'm just thinking about people moving around Lagos with helicopters, but that's a different conversation. But yes, I thank you for that. I think that there's definitely a lot to be said there, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be looking at as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Udah, for this wonderful presentation and Q&A discussion. I now hand over to Professor Makoni for some last words, and then to Kim to announce the next speaker. You are muted, Prof.
Thank you very much for reminding us about the importance of water, roads, waste, and how we are all connected in the same space. Kim, can you let us know who is coming next?